The deal Canada refused was the cornerstone of Trump's negotiating strategy, meant to validate his approach. This assumption wasn't reckless. It was rooted in precedent, as Canada has never been adversarial and is integrated into the U.S. economy. Historically, when Washington pushed, Ottawa negotiated. When Washington escalated, Canada absorbed pressure and waited. That rhythm both sides understood broke this time. Canada's rejection was procedural and institutional, delivered in diplomatic language, message unmistakable. The terms no longer aligned with Washington's assumptions. When a middle power with incentive to compromise chooses not to, it signals deeper than politics. It means internal mathematics have changed. Institutions, ruthless accountants. This moment is significant not just for the rejection, but what it reveals about credibility, as deals fail when enforcement, reputational capital, and future expectations stop aligning. Washington's negotiating strategy under Trump relied on asymmetric pressure, using tariffs and public threats, which created strategic fatigue among allies like Canada. Deals announced as victories were often reopened, leading to instability that institutions inherently avoid. From Ottawa's perspective, the question shifted from signing a deal to whether it could be relied upon. American strategists misread the situation, assuming geographic proximity guaranteed compliance, but Canada's rejection was a calculated recalibration. The foundational stability of the U.S.-Canada relationship eroded, with agreements becoming provisional and commitments losing durability. This procedural shift, coupled with reputational damage from pressure replacing trust, prompted Canada to quietly diversify its options and de-risk. Canada's patience gained leverage, revealing Washington's miscalculation that pressure would accelerate compliance. This quiet institutional adjustment led to a recalibration of expectations across allied capitals, demonstrating that resistance is survivable. This moment teaches us that modern power prioritizes credibility over leverage and predictability over pressure, with institutional learning shaping relations far more than any single deal. For decades, the U.S.-Canada relationship operated on an unspoken premise. Disagreements were real, but the foundational stability was never in question. Trade disputes would arise, but the overarching framework held firm. Leaders changed, rhetoric fluctuated, yet the institutional backbone, the expectation of continuity, remained intact. That premise allowed Canada to absorb shocks without fundamentally revising its strategy. That premise eroded gradually, then suddenly. The first shift was procedural. Agreements stopped behaving like agreements. Negotiations became provisional by default, subject to reopening, reframing, or public renegotiation. From an institutional standpoint, this matters more than any single tariff or policy clause. When commitments lose durability, the cost of compliance rises exponentially. Planning becomes harder. Investment slows. Risk premiums increase. Canada's trade and foreign policy apparatus is deeply conservative in the technical sense. It prioritizes predictability over upside potential, stability over spectacle. The civil service is designed to outlast governments and personalities. When that apparatus detects sustained volatility in a partner's behavior, it doesn't retaliate, it insulates. The second shift was reputational. Washington began treating leverage as a substitute for trust rather than a complement to it. Pressure replaced persuasion. This strategy works when the pressured party believes the outcome is fixed and the pain temporary. It fails when the outcome itself becomes unclear. From Ottawa's perspective, the critical question wasn't, can we survive this deal? But rather, what precedent does accepting these terms establish? If compliance today encourages harder demands tomorrow, the rational move is resistance, not accommodation. Institutions think in sequences, not isolated moments. There's also a structural asymmetry Washington frequently overlooks. Yes, Canada depends heavily on access to American markets. But the United States also depends on Canada for supply chain continuity, energy reliability, and regulatory coordination across critical sectors. Dependence cuts both ways, just not always evenly or visibly. Canada's institutions have spent recent years quietly diversifying options. Not decoupling, that would be unrealistic, but de-risking. They've strengthened ties with Europe, expanded Asia-Pacific trade pathways, and reinforced multilateral dispute mechanisms. None of this replaces the United States, but it reduces the cost of saying no. That context explains why this rejection wasn't impulsive. It was the product of accumulated institutional learning. Each renegotiation, each tariff threat, each public ultimatum fed into a continuously recalculated baseline. Washington was no longer perceived as a reliably stable actor. This is where historical misunderstanding frequently occurs. American strategists often interpret Allied restraint as weakness. In reality, it's frequently optionality. Canada didn't confront the United States because confrontation wasn't necessary. It simply declined to validate a negotiating model premised on inevitability.
There's an intellectual tradition associated with thinkers like George Will that emphasizes institutions as the true carriers of power, not leaders or prevailing moods. This moment fits squarely within that analytical framework. Canada's decision wasn't about who occupied the White House. It was about what kind of system Washington appeared to be operating. Once institutions conclude that a partner treats agreements as tactical rather than structural, cooperation becomes fundamentally conditional. Deals are no longer anchors, they're experiments. And experiments demand caution. The core miscalculation wasn't tactical, it was conceptual. Decision-makers in Washington believed that leverage still operated as it had a decade earlier. That belief shaped everything that followed. The assumption was straightforward. Canada needs the deal more than the United States does. Therefore, pressure would accelerate compliance. Deadlines would concentrate attention. Public framing would narrow available options. In short, resistance would prove too costly, forcing movement. That logic isn't irrational. It's simply outdated. What changed isn't Canada's dependence, it's Canada's tolerance for uncertainty. That distinction matters far more than Washington recognized. Pressure works effectively when the pressured party believes the outcome is fixed and the pain temporary. But when the outcome itself feels unstable, pressure stops accelerating agreement and starts incentivizing delay. The Trump negotiating style treated time as an enemy. Deals were framed as victories requiring immediate closure before markets reacted, domestic opposition hardened, or political cycles shifted. Speed became virtue. Hesitation was framed as weakness. Canada's institutions interpreted this urgency differently, not as strength, but as asymmetric need. When one side requires closure more urgently than the other, the side capable of patient waiting gains leverage. Washington believed unpredictability created tactical advantage. Canada concluded unpredictability increased strategic risk. Those assessments cannot coexist without generating friction. Inside the US system, pressure was perceived as a force multiplier. Inside the Canadian system, it was interpreted as a signal that enforcement norms were weakening. That's not a moral judgment. It's a bureaucratic assessment. When rules feel fluid, institutions decelerate. They consult more extensively. They escalate decisions internally. They widen review apertures. The result is paralysis that resembles resistance. There was also a fundamental misreading of audience. The deal was framed for domestic American consumption, proof of toughness, evidence of dominance, confirmation that allies still respond to force. But Canada's decision-makers weren't optimizing for American headlines. They were optimizing for internal institutional coherence. Accepting a deal under duress creates domestic precedent. It signals to future negotiators that escalation produces concessions. For a mid-sized power that must negotiate repeatedly with larger actors, that precedent is dangerous. So Canada declined. Not because it expected retaliation to be painless, but because it calculated that the long-term cost of acquiescence exceeded the short-term cost of friction. What followed Canada's refusal wasn't dramatic retaliation. Instead, what emerged was institutional adjustment. Quiet, incremental, and largely invisible to casual observers. This is how mature systems respond when leverage fails. They don't lash out, they reposition. Inside Washington, the rejection forced a recalibration officials would never frame publicly. Pressure had been applied. Expected compliance hadn't materialized. That meant the strategy required review. But institutions rarely admit misjudgment outright. They adapt around it. Negotiating timelines slowed. Language softened. The urgency that once framed the deal as essential began dissipating in official communications. Not because the deal suddenly mattered less, but because its failure could no longer appear consequential. Institutions protect credibility by managing expectations. The second-order consequences arrived not as punishment, but as drift. And drift damages influence far more than confrontation ever could. The immediate outcome looked contained. No trade war, no diplomatic freeze. But beneath that surface calm, the fundamental geometry of power shifted in subtle yet durable ways. Canada's refusal recalibrated expectations across allied capitals. When a close, deeply integrated ally decides that delay is safer than agreement, it communicates something uncomfortable to other partners. Resistance is survivable. This doesn't produce rebellion, it produces caution. And caution compounds. Allies began approaching Washington with thicker legal buffers, longer review timelines, and fewer assumptions of finality. Step back from this specific deal and the personalities fade quickly. What remains is a lesson about how modern power behaves when institutions, not leaders, do the real work. Canada's rejection was a stress test, and the results were quietly conclusive. It demonstrated that credibility now matters more than leverage, that predictability outperforms pressure, and that institutions adapt faster than political narratives acknowledge. For much of the post-war era, American power benefited from an assumption of permanence. Allies disagreed with Washington, sometimes sharply, but rarely doubted that commitments would endure long enough to justify compromise. That assumption functioned as invisible capital, reducing transaction costs and making pressure effective, because it operated within a stable system. What this moment revealed isn't that American power has disappeared, but that this invisible capital has thinned. When institutions begin treating U.S. commitments as provisional, leverage becomes noisier and less efficient. Pressure still exists, but it produces hesitation rather than compliance. This episode tells us that modern power is less about forcing agreement and more about sustaining belief. Belief that terms will hold, that concessions won't be reopened, that compliance will actually conclude negotiations. When that belief fades, institutions stop rushing. They stop conceding early. They start waiting. Canada waited. Washington discovered it could be waited out. That's not collapse, it's recalibration. And when systems recalibrate quietly, they rarely reverse course quickly. The invisible architecture of power had shifted, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of institutional learning. And that shift will shape bilateral relations far longer than any single deal ever could.